That was John Reddick with a song called No Fear. You're on Rhema 94.9. It is at 4:15 and it's Tuesday afternoon. That means Creation Ministries International afternoon. And, of course, this week we have Michael Thompson from CMI. And we had Michael last week. It was absolutely awesome. And this week, let me first say, hi, Michael. How are you going?
Hi, Mick. Good. How are you?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. It's great to have you back. And this week I'm kind of excited. There was on YouTube a video came out yesterday, I believe, and it was about the Bajau people. You could probably say it better than I can. They're sea nomads who live in villages in Indonesia. And, we're going to be talking about these amazing free divers from Indonesia who can dive as deep as 70 metres on a single breath while hunting for food. Now, I was up in the Whitsundays recently. I can dive pretty deep too. I can go to about 3 metres, but not quite 70 metres. And, of course, people are saying, hey, these guys have evolved. Can you first tell us, Michael, what is free diving?
A lot of interesting things to talk about. The freediving is essentially, if you go snorkeling, that's not quite freediving, but you're pretty close. As soon as you spit that snorkel out of your mouth and then hold your breath and dive down, as soon as you're under the water on your own breath, rather than scuba gear or pressurized air through a tube, you're freediving. So you're diving on just your own breath. And technically the term freediving is often it's actually used for people who actually train specifically for freediving as a sport, where they actually go out into the ocean or deep areas of water, put a big line down on a rope with a buoy at the top, and they'll clip themselves to the line, and then they'll just hold their breath and just see how deep they can dive down and swim back up. And it's quite dangerous because you can imagine if you're pushing the limits of your body, you can black out. And of course, there's pressure as you go deeper, so your ears start to hurt more unless you equalize properly. So there's a lot to it, but it's actually, any freediver will tell you that if you manage the risks well, it's actually very relaxing and calming, and it's quite a interesting sport, yeah.
Yes, well, I've had Dr. John from Creation Ministries, of course. He was a naval doctor, and he's done a lot of the deep sea, the submarine escape training, which he sort of briefly talked to us about before. I don't think it was as calm for those guys, though.
Right. So they were working in like underwater currents and low visibility, like that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, one of the places apparently was over in the UK where they're in this giant tank and they've got to, come out of, I guess, a pretend submarine. It would have been in a tank and sort of swim back to the surface. I don't know if they go down from the top. He hasn't got that far with it. But, as far as these guys, these freedivers in Indonesia, they're sporting, right? They just do it for sport?
Oh, well, no, they do it for a living, for their livelihood, and they've actually it's a generational community of freedivers, or a freediving community, and they live on these houseboats, or sort of, they're like houseboats or houses on stilts on reefs. And so they're literally, a lot of these people are born and grow up with the ocean is their literal backyard. And so they live on the ocean, and their food and and even what they sell for income these days is just the fish of the ocean. So they dive down with spear guns, or they collect, so they hunt fish, or they'll collect marine life, like clams and things like that off the sea floor. And of course, the deeper you can dive, there's more food you can access. So they're and they do these massive deep dives without all the specialized training that people have researched now. Like, this is just their traditional, how they train their own people, and they don't have all the expensive equipment that we might use. They've got some equipment that they make themselves, but yeah, they really do put they're an inspiration, put it this way.
Mm.
So everyone who loves freediving, they look to these people and go, wow, they're the real deal.
How do they get down that deep? I mean, I know, in salt water it's kind of hard to get too deep. I've sort of been as deep as I could up on Fraser Island in one of the freshwater lakes up there, and that was easy to get down. It was actually really hard to get back up. But in salt water it's hard to get down. How do they do that?
Yeah, well, I think some of them will actually, they might grab some rocks or things like that, or some of the modern ones today will use a weight belt or weights if they have it. Yep. But the other thing, and this comes to the biology of side of things too, is they actually, a lot of them are quite lean, and the percentage of body fat someone has is related to how buoyant they are in the water.
Yep.
So if someone's very lean, they'll actually, even on a full breath, they won't float quite as high in the water. And when they dive down, their neutral buoyancy point will be, they'll reach that much quicker. And then when you go past it, you start sinking. And so the effort they have to put in to get past that neutral buoyancy point is much less than someone who, might be a bit fuller in shape. And or if they've got a wetsuit, which has a lot of buoyancy, so there's they're clearly very skilled to get down there anyway. But it's a small factor that actually does play into this.
Yeah. So these guys being able to go so deep, and some of these videos you see on YouTube and stuff, they talk about, these people have evolved over, centuries, and, their fathers weren't quite as good as, they just say they're getting better over time. When it comes to evolution and when it comes to, the genetic advantage these guys have, is that how it works for them?
Well, there was some research done, and there does seem to be something genetic going on here. And so what these researchers did is they went there and they did some ultrasound measurements on these people. And importantly, they did the measurements on both the people who were actively diving and the people who lived there who didn't do the diving. They were just, had other jobs around the place to do. Wasn't their thing to go diving.
Yep.
And the ultrasound measurements were to measure the size of their spleen. And they found that both the divers and the people who didn't dive, but are part of the same community, same bloodline, I guess you could say, had larger spleens on average than most people around the world. So why has that got anything to do with freediving? Well, that's because when you hold your breath for a certain amount of time, or relative to your maximum breath hold, your body's very well designed. It's got a natural mechanism where it'll actually contract the spleen instinctually, and that contraction of the spleen actually releases a little boost of oxygenated red blood cells. And so this research paper that I've been looking at, where I found out a lot of this information, they said that it can increase oxygen in the blood supply by about 3 to 9%. So it's not a huge amount, but it makes a big difference. If you're down there looking for a fish, and you just need another 10, 20 seconds for that fish to get in range so you can catch it.
Yep.
That's the difference between getting a meal for the day or not.
Wow. They must stay under there for a fair while. You mentioned genetics and mutation. I can imagine people might claim this is evolution. And I've heard some people talking on social media about this being evolution. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, so even the paper that I've, the source paper where these, reports come from, they thought this is an example of recent human evolution. But what it really is, it's an example of natural selection, but not evolution. And some people think, well, that doesn't make sense, because they think evolution is just natural selection. But there's a bit of a difference. And this is a really good example to show that difference. So the mutation that these people had happened to be beneficial for their specific lifestyle, which requires freediving for food and income.
Yep.
But this mutation hasn't brought about new information, and it also isn't entirely beneficial. So the mutated gene was a thyroid hormone regulation gene, and that's the key there. It's a regulation gene, and so it's the gene is the programming for something that regulates how much thyroid hormone is produced. And so the way to think about it is like if you've got a tap and it's got a nice seal that works well, you can turn it on, turn it off. But if that seal's a bit broken, it's a bit leaky and it's not fully functional. It's actually lost functionality.
Yep.
And so the mutation has that effect on the thyroid hormone. And what that happens to do, one of the side effects, which is positive in the case of these freedivers, is that it leads to a larger spleen size. And the researchers did some research on mice by using the same gene mutation in mice, and they noticed that the mice grew larger spleens, so they could confirm roughly that was the case. But the downside, and this is what the testing they did in the mice, was that they found that the mice that had these larger spleens because of the gene, their metabolism went up incredibly, so or enough to make a difference. So it meant that they burned through calories quicker.
Yep.
And so in a survival situation, that means like if you've got scarce food around and say you're living on the land rather than the ocean where you've got lots of food supply, it's actually a detriment to your survival because you're not going to last as long with the food you've consumed because your body burns through it quicker. So it comes with, it's really a trade-off and if anything, a loss of information genetically, then actually evolving, which requires new information genetically, or in the sense that it brings new functionality, which isn't the case here.
Yeah, right. So the mutation hasn't actually given them new abilities. It's like a side effect from a broken function that happens to be beneficial to their specific lifestyle.
That's exactly right. So a good example is actually that it's comparable. This is a much larger scale example of this in terms of difference changes to a species. But there's a bird in the Galapagos Islands called the flightless cormorant. A cormorant's like an ocean bird that you might feed in a coastal estuary that's diving under and hunting fish.
Yep.
And there's these cormorants that obviously flew over to the islands one day, and the population established, and there's a mutation in them that actually caused it might be a number of mutations. It caused the feathers in their wings to, if you actually see these birds, a lot of the feathers are really, there's kind of missing feathers, and essentially they can't fly anymore. And so they've got a mutation where they've lost the ability to fly. But it happens that when you got less feathers on your stubs of, your little arm wing things, then you can swim a little bit better. And so you can catch fish better. And to survive on that island, catching fish is a bit more helpful than being able to fly long distances.
Yep.
And of course, the ones that could fly, when they couldn't get as many fish, they just fly back to the mainland or somewhere else. So it's not like the flightless birds have evolved. They've lost functionality, and it just happens to be that for on that island, if you only live on that island, then they can actually survive and reproduce there.
Yeah, wow.
And so that's an example. And again, that's a much bigger change in lost functionality than the Bajau freedivers. And again, one thing to make a point about is that when we're talking about mutations, all human beings have got mutations, and like chances are, so it's not that certain people groups are more mutated than others or anything like that. Like I've probably got 10 times more mutations. I've got all sorts of health issues, but we've all got mutations that affect us. So what's so cool about the Bajau people group is that it actually benefits their specific lifestyle, even though it's a loss of information.
Wow. Wow, that's incredible. Well, you are on Rhema 94.9. It's 29 minutes past 4. We're with Michael Thompson from Creation Ministries International, and we'll be back shortly. If you have any questions for Michael, please send them through to our text line. It is 0401 949 949. And coming up next, we've got Colton Dixon with Rest of My Life. That was for King and Country and Taylor Hill with World on Fire. You're on 94.9. It is 4:39 and we have Michael Thompson on the line from Creation Ministries International. And we've been talking about, diving, free diving, Indonesian populations who have over the years become better at diving down to like 70 metres, which is nuts. And, it sounds like it's not really, it's not evolution as we know it. It's a little bit different. I mean, when it comes to, the divers that Dr. John has talked about, submarine training, could they, evolve into these amazing free divers?
Yeah, good question. So it's more to do with what genes you just happen to have at birth. And so if those divers in training, let's say some of them were born with genes that maybe like the thyroid hormone mutation or some other gene that just happens to help them in the specific survival situation they train for.
Yep.
And then another couple of the divers were born without those genes.
Mm-hmm.
Then, in the unfortunate event that the survival training is a really tricky event and some of them don't make it, the ones with not good genes for it, then, of course, the ones with the better survival genes for that specific situation, they have kids and they pass those genes on. So that those genes that aid that survival in that specific submarine situation get preserved. And so that would be what's called artificial, in some sense, artificial selection rather than natural selection, because it's sort of a man-made environment for survival.
Yeah.
But not evolution necessarily. It'd be more like the ones who didn't have the right genes for that survival have had a loss of function in their genes, or maybe like the Bajau, the ones who survived had a loss of their information, but it happened to be a side effect of that was good for that particular survival. So It's not evolution in the new information, new function.
Yep.
But you do get preservation of genes that fit well for particular survival situations.
Right, okay. Well, are there any other people groups around the world with this diving mutation?
Yeah, good question. So the researchers who did this research on the Bajau people, that was the next thing they did. It was only a couple of years later, and they published another paper because they heard about a group in South Korea who have had a generational freediving community.
Okay.
And they actually they said, okay, we better measure their spleens and see if there's a link here. Maybe they've got the same gene mutation. And so they did the measurements and they found that their spleens weren't larger than average. They were fairly normal and they didn't tend to have that gene mutation.
Yep.
But they found some other interesting things about that this people group in South Korea had a better heart rate response when they dove, so they could keep the heart rate nice and low, which means if you're beating out, heart's beating less, you consume less oxygen,
Yep.
You get to hold your breath for longer, and blood pressure response and cold water tolerance. And I think from memory, when I read the paper, it was a combination of these things which could affect the chance of successful pregnancies.
So they're all mutations, but they're still beneficial for diving, but they're different mutations to what the Indonesians had.
Well, here's the key: they couldn't perfectly correlate these with actual genes or gene mutations or gene variants. Some of these actually could be well explained by just the fact that they've done it since a young age and they've trained it. So with the Bajau divers and their increased spleen size,
Yep.
If you do freediving training, you actually will, grow a slightly bigger spleen. It does, it's like the muscles or the spleen gets a little bit bigger.
Mm.
But if you had a Bajau person and someone who doesn't have their genes, both do the same training, the Bajau will still have an advantage because they've got the genetic, advantage from the start. But in the case of the South Korean divers, a lot of the results they found, that the study they said, they couldn't Some of them they were pretty sure were genetic, but they didn't have enough evidence to know for sure, because sometimes it can just be that everyone in that community have all done the same training.
Yep.
And so they've all just trained that into there, and that's not a genetic thing, that's just a training response. So
okay, so Navy divers could train to get a little bit better, but obviously they won't have those mutations.
That's right. And when you train to get better, you're not changing your genes that you're going to pass on to the next generation. So it's, in that case, it's not a natural selection thing happening. That only happens when it's actually, these abilities are better or worse because of your genes from birth. So that's the difference here. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So how do these freedivers train to hold their breath for so long? I mean, I've tried it. I've tried it a few times. I jump under the pool. I can't stay there for more than probably a minute. These guys, some people stay down there for ages.
Yeah. So I'm very interested in this actually, because I'm a part of my local freediving club.
Okay.
It's something I very much enjoy. And one of the things that they do for training, you do it at home, but you ought to know what you're doing with people who have got safety qualifications and stuff. But what you're trying to do is increase your oxygen efficiency, as in how you want your body to use oxygen slower and not as quickly, so you can hold your breath for longer.
Yep.
But the other flip side, and this is a little bit dangerous, but the flip side is that when you feel the urge to breathe, that's not because your body's sensing that you've got not much oxygen left. It's actually because your body's sensing that when the oxygen, converts to CO2, what you breathe out, your body's sensing there's too much CO2. Right. And so what it turns out that you generally can actually hold your breath much longer than that response. But the problem is that when you push the boundaries, you're going beyond the design safety mechanism within your system to keep you within the safety margins of blacking out. And so if you train yourself to be more tolerant to the unpleasant experience of carbon dioxide in your body building up, which is what makes you want to breathe, then you can actually extend your dive time. But of course, you're pushing the boundaries past the natural response, which is very well designed to keep you alive and not blacking out. And then when you push too far, then it's hard to know how close you really are to blacking out.
So you should only do this when you're with someone that knows what they're doing.
That's right. So it is undoubtedly a risky sport. But what people do is they set, they work out what their maximum breath hold is, and then they work out what percentage of that I should do my training at. And you don't push too far beyond. And if you stay within safe limits, then you can develop a breath hold. So I've been doing this for about a year or two. I think I can get to just shy of 4 minutes under the water. So the training does work, but you do have to be very careful.
Wow. That's amazing. Now, where can people go if they want to know more about this? Yeah,
well, I won't be able to point them to any freediving resources because that's not my qualification to do. But for Creation Ministries, we've got heaps of resources about the interesting science behind how these things work and how to understand evolution and natural selection. What's the difference? So if people go to creation.com, our website, there's a tab at the top where it says the magazine, the Creation magazine.
Yep.
And this is probably our best resource where we equip people with responding to fascinating science papers and discoveries and research. A lot of it just points to how amazing our God is and how well he designed things.
Yep.
And then some of the research where people claim evolution and billions of years and things like that, we appreciate the good research they've done, but then show people how to interpret that data the right way. And the data does point to the biblical timeline, really. And we help people to, put the right worldview lens on to interpret it correctly. So Creation magazine, it comes out 4 times a year. It's a great resource to get this information and really be equipped. So when that next science story that comes out, which is just fascinating, and people at work are talking about it, you could actually have a gospel conversation opportunity right there when you're equipped with that knowledge. So it's a really good resource.
Absolutely. And of course, that website, creation.com. Well, Michael Thompson, we're at the end of another awesome week. Thank you so much for your time this week. And, well, that was 2 weeks. Our time's already up, but I believe we've got you back again in January, Feb, March, April, May, June. Yes, 2nd of June we've got you next. So I'm looking forward to it already, Michael.
Excellent. Thanks, Mick. Looking forward to it.
All righty, you're on 94.9. It is 4:49. We've got Dan Brems up next with Up Again.